Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich freue mich, Sie als Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer unserer heutigen Veranstaltung in der Kolloquiumsreihe des Deutschen Zentrums Kulturgutverluste begrüßen zu dürfen. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm delighted to be able to welcome you as a participant in our event today in the series of colloquiums organized by the German Lost Art Foundation. Wenn Sie bereits vor 2 Wochen zugesehen und zugehört haben, wissen Sie, dass wir 3 Gesprächsrunden mit Nachfahrinnen und Nachfahren jüdischer Kunstsammlerinnen und Kunstsammler vorbereitet haben. Und dies geschah aus einem ganz bestimmten konkreten Anlass. Das Jahr 2021 wird als Festjahr begangen. Als Festjahr, denn im Jahr 2021 leben Jüdinnen und Juden nachweislich seit 1700 Jahren auf dem Gebiet des heutigen Deutschlands. Aus diesem Anlass wird das Festjahr Hashtag 2021 JLID, Jüdisches Leben in Deutschland, mit bundesweit rund 1000 Veranstaltungen ausgerichtet und von der Bundesregierung unterstützt. Ziel ist es, jüdisches Leben sichtbar und erlebbar zu machen und dem erstarkenden Antisemitismus etwas entgegenzusetzen. Nähere Informationen finden Sie auf der Webseite 2021 jlid.de. If you watched and listened 2 weeks ago, you know that we have prepared 3 rounds of talks with descendants of Jewish art collectors. And this happened for a very specific reason. The year 2021 is celebrated as a festival year. As a festival year because the year 2021 is the year that we know we have the knowledge that Jews are living since 2,700 years on the territory that's now belong to Germany. The festival year hashtag 2021 Jewish Life in Germany will be celebrated with around 1,000 events nationwide, direct and supported by the German federal government. The aim is to make Jewish life visible and tangible and to get something out of the growing Antisemitismus to be sent. Jüdische Kunstsammlerinnen und Sammler haben das kulturelle Leben in Deutschland über Jahrhunderte hinweg mitgeprägt. In der Zeit des Nationalsozialismus wurden sie entrechtet und verfolgt. Ihre Sammlungen sind bis heute oftmals verschollen. Das Deutsche Zentrum Kulturgutverluste unterstützt Nachfahren und Nachfahren jüdischer Sammler und Sammlerinnen dabei, ihrem verlorenen Erbe nachzuforschen. Im Rahmen des Festjahrs berichten sie selbst von ihrer Suche. In der vergangenen Woche Adam Ganz, heute Hagar Lev und in 14 Tagen Dodi Reifenberg. Sie sprechen über die Rekonstruktion verlorener Sammlungen, erzählen Familiengeschichten und beleuchten ihr eigenes Verhältnis zu Deutschland im Jahr 2021. Jewish art collectors have shaped cultural life in Germany for centuries. During the time of National Socialism, they were erased and persecuted, and the collections are often hidden and up to the present day. The German Lost Art Foundation supports descendants of Jewish collectors to research their lost heritage. In the context of the festival year, Jewish Life in Germany, they reported their own search. Adam Ganz, Hagar Lev, and Dodi Reifenberg talk in this little series about the reconstruction of lost collections, about the history of their families and their own relationship to Germany in the year 2021. Heute, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen, spürt Hagar Lev im Gespräch mit der Kunsthistorikerin Emily Bilski der Geschichte ihres Urgroßvaters Karl Adler nach. Der Münchner Fabrikant sammelte Werke der zeitgenössischen Avantgarde. Er wurde 1938 im Konzentrationslager Dachau ermordet. Seiner Frau Emilie gelang die Flucht nach Palästina zu ihren Kindern. Die mindestens 130 Kunstwerke aus dem Besitz der Adlers sind seither verschollen. In einem Projekt, das vom Zentrum gefördert wird, forscht Hagar Lev in Zusammenarbeit mit der Provenienzforscherin Vanessa Vogt dem Verbleib der Sammlung stellvertretend für die Nachfahren und Nachfahrinnen von Karl Adler und seiner Frau Emilie nach. Hagar Lev wuchs in Israel auf, arbeitet immer noch in der IT-Branche und lebt heute in Leipzig. Emily Bilski ist Kunsthistorikerin und war, wie viele von Ihnen wissen, für das Jüdische Museum in München als Kuratorin tätig. Hier erinnere ich an die Ausstellung und entsprechende Publikationen zur modernen Galerie von Heinrich Tannhauser und zur Kunstsammlung der Pringsheim unter dem Titel Nichts als Kultur, sowie auch zur Kunst- und Antiquitätenfirma Bernheimer. Today, Hagar Lev traces the story of her grandfather Karl Adler in a conversation with the art historian Emily Bilski. The Munich collected works, Karl Adler collected works of the contemporary avant-garde art. He was murdered in 1938 in the Dachau concentration camp. His wife Emily managed to escape to Palestine to her children. The 130 works of art from the Adler collection have since this time sealed up. In a project that was founded by the center, Hagar Lev conducts research in collaboration with the provenance researcher Vanessa Vogt. Hagar Lev grew up in Israel, is working in the IT branch, and she's living now in Leipzig. Emily Bilski is an art historian and worked for the Jewish Museum in Munich, and they curated exhibitions to the Modern Gallery by Heinrich Tannhauser, or to the art collection of the Pringsheim family and the Art and Antiquities Company Bernheimer. Seien Sie herzlich willkommen, Hagar Lev und Emily Bilski. Wir freuen uns auf ein interessantes und ganz sicherlich auch anregendes Gespräch. Bevor ich an Emily Bilski übergebe, möchte ich alle Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer bitten, ihre Mikrofone stumm zu schalten und auch die Übertragung per Kamera zu beenden. Fragen und Diskussionsbeiträge können Sie uns über die Chat-Funktion mitteilen und ich werde sie dann mit Unterstützung des Teams vom Zentrum hier vortragen, damit sie von Hagar Lev und Emily Bilski beantwortet werden können. Bitte schön, Emily und Hagar, Sie haben das Wort. A warm welcome to Hagar Lev and Emily Bilski. We are looking forward to an interesting and certainly stimulating conversation. Before I hand over to Emily Bilski, I would like to ask all listeners to mute their microphones and also to stop the transmission via camera. You can send us questions and contributions to the discussion via the chat function, and I will try to read the questions so that Hagar Lev and Emily Bilski can answer. Here you go, Emily and Hagar, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hartman, first for that very kind introduction, and also many thanks to you and to Lena Gruber and all of your colleagues at the German Lost Art Foundation for inviting me to participate in this really important series of programs that you have organized, introducing the stories of Jewish collectors in Germany as told by their descendants, which is I think, really significant and new way of looking at it. It forms a very important contribution to this year where we are acknowledging and celebrating the rich and complicated 1700-year history of Jews living in German lands. As you mentioned, we will hear tonight from Hagar Lev about her great-grandfather, Karl Adler, who had a collection of modern art with a particular focus on prints and drawings. Noteworthy also was Karl Adler's collecting of works by contemporary Munich artists, demonstrating his civic role as a supporter of local talent. You mentioned in the introduction the exhibitions that three of which I did at the Jewish Museum in Munich, and that was part of the opening year of the museum in 2007, a year of special exhibitions dedicated to Jewish collectors and art dealers in Munich. Munich was an internationally important art market with a very, very vibrant art scene, and Jews in the city played a huge role in the cultural activity as gallerists, auction house owners, and collectors. And I must say, we did a lot of research and made many discoveries in the course of that year. However, we never came across the name of Karl Adler. And to me, that was very significant because of this history and what we will hear in a moment from Hagar, Karl Adler, as important as his collection was, had pretty much become invisible. And so the research that is being undertaken and supported here is so significant, taking important steps to rectify the situation and bringing to light the important activities of people like Karl Adler. And tonight we're going to hear quite a gripping story from his great-granddaughter, Hagar Lev. So Hagar, let's begin with actually what set you on this journey. How did you become aware of Karl Adler and his collection?
Let me share my screen and we'll get to the story. Okay. So we're going to speak today about my great-grandparents, Karl and Emilia Adler. But my original interest was in my grandfather, Erich Glass. You can see him here with his mom, Jenny. Erich, later to be called Eri in Israel, was the only child of a single mom before that expression even existed. Jenny Lindenmann was an aspiring actress and a souffleuse, and her brother was Gustav Lindenmann, and his wife was Louise Dumont. So a very artistic family. But Erich and Maria were on their own, wandering across the little towns and villages where Jenny could get work. And I knew as a little girl, I heard many stories about Erich. You can see him here on the right. His mom died when he was very young, and he grew up in boarding schools. And at the age of 17, he was recruited as a soldier to World War I, fighting in the very trenches on the Western Front in Flanders, Belgium. You can see here his unit being presented to von Hindenburg. And he was later severely wounded and went back to combat as a flown observer, an aerial photographer for intelligence purposes, and won the Eisernes Kreuz for his service, the highest decoration. When he was injured and didn't fight for a while, he frequented the military library, where he met an officer who was at that time too old to fight and was the librarian. His name was Karl Adler. And Karl was really fascinated by the young officer who took so much interest in philosophy and art and history and books, and they became friends. And after the war, Erich, who originally planned to be an engineer, changed his plans and became an artist. And here you can see him drawing outside. And I grew up looking at these pictures, the first images, very dark, post-World War I, with depression and hopelessness. And later on, many other pictures with the guiding principle that an artist should first and foremost depict the reality that he sees. And even when there was fantasy involved, the drawings remained true to realism and to depict reality as it was. I was growing up looking at these pictures hanging at my parents' walls and at friends in the kibbutz's walls. And he was so true to his profession. This is one example of where he actually spent 2 weeks disguised as a doctor in a psychiatric ward to picture the people who were there. And you can see when looking at these pictures, it was so important to him to know the people he was drawing and to like them. Later on, went to the School of Graphic Arts in Munich and the Bauhaus. And then I started looking into the Adler home. Why? Because after the war, while he was studying at the Bauhaus, he had a short-lived marriage in Weimar and had a son named Gotthard Glass, later on Uzi Gall. And when this relationship ended, he became closer and closer to the Adler family. He kept in touch with Karl Adler, and he frequented their family home in Munich. You can see it here. And there were 5 children there, the eldest being Susie Shoshana, my grandmother, Irene, Rina, Lothar, Meir, August, Aryeh, and Reuven. And he and Shoshana, Susie, became in love and ended up marrying each other. Towards the end of 1933, where things were headed the wrong way in Germany, he took maybe the first ever selfie with his wife and the son who was later born, Michael, his second son, and they headed to Israel, to a place and a scene quite different than the elegance and artistic and bohemian circles that he was accustomed to, Kibbutz Yegur. His first days at the kibbutz, there was no need for an artist. So he did what was needed. He worked as a carpenter, he worked as a night guard, he taught art, and he was a photographer. And just like the artist that he was, he continued to depict the reality that he saw. And people at work, children's homes, children on the kibbutz grew in children's home and not with their parents. How looking up something actually entailed opening a book, and how a news feed was an actual newspaper. And he looked at the children cleaning and working and playing and documenting sports events. And I grew up looking at these pictures as well. He had 4 sons. Uzi joined them in Israel after some time. Michael, Yoram, my father, and the youngest one, Reuven. And he drew as well. With some time, he was able to go back to his art, and he actually had the first atelier in the kibbutz. And what he was depicting changed the scenes of a young kibbutz, barren land, his children reading books, Jews and Arabs living together, animals, people, and the sea, which he loved so much, especially in the years later on where he lived in Akko, a port city in the northern part of Israel. And I grew up with these stories, and I grew to admire him, his courage, his unconventional thinking, how he moved from this to this, and how here you can see him drawing in one of the kibbutz festivities. Everyone's dressed in white, and how different these two scenes were, and with time, how we adjusted. And then myself and my cousins were very big family, cousins and uncles. We started thinking this was an initiative from an uncle of my dad, Giora, he's on the call with us today, to maybe try and install Stolpersteine next to the Adler home in Munich. And we started working with the Munich chapter of the Stolperstein. And then I learned more about Karl and Emilia.
So can you tell us some more about, we've learned now a lot about Eric Glass, about Karl and Emilia, about their family, but also a bit about Karl, about his professional life and his many interests.
Yep. So Emilia was a wise woman, very kind, came from a big family. She actually had 6 siblings. We can see 3 of her sisters here with her. And they had 5 children. Karl was, as we know, an officer in World War I, and he was the owner of a successful feather factory for beddings, for pillows, one of the biggest ones of the time. He traveled extensively the world. He brought a lot of treasures from different countries, and they loved their life in Munich. They loved their children and the big family, and they loved art. This is their Wohnzimmer, their living room. And then I started learning a little bit about the collection.
So how did that come about, actually? How did you become aware of his passion for art? Was that something that was discussed in your family? One can certainly see in these photographs that they lived surrounded by art. How did this enter your awareness, Hagar?
Well, you know, that generation didn't speak a lot, and I always knew it was an artistic home. And I knew that in his travels around the world, when looking at these pictures, I could see the art in the back. I didn't know much about anything special about the collection. That I only learned later. I did know that when I started looking into it, that on top of the classic art and the Renaissance and what was bon ton at the time, they had pictures and prints of modern artists, which wasn't so common at the time.
If you show the next slide.
Yeah. So,
okay.
yeah.
Because this must have been quite a surprise.
Yes. So during my work with, like I said, the Stopplerstein team in Munich, I was amazed at what diligent work they do, and they started sending me more and more information. And at some point, I received this article from the Süddeutsche Zeitung from, I think, 2016. Yeah, it is. And the words in the first paragraph had my heart frozen, because they spoke of how the looters moved in every night and they rang the doorbells of featherbed manufacturer Karl Adler, among another list of people. And this was the first time that I've learned that my great-grandparents, my family in Munich, was subject to this kind of confiscation. Someone needs to mute there's an echo. I was very shocked, and then I realized that all of these years I've been so focused on my grandfather and wanting to know more about his art and about his remarkable life story. And here there was a whole new treasure box that I had not looked into. And I looked at the family tree. You can see here the names of the 5 Adler children, their German names, and then their Hebrew names that they received. And we started constructing together with my cousins a wider family tree, which I'm showing you here, very miniature, no one can read it, and it's actually a very partial family tree. In the process, we saw that the family tree is actually 80 centimeters long if you print it out on a paper. And Lotal's wife was named Zila. You can see her here. So she's an aunt of my father. And Zila lived to almost 104 years old. She passed away in 2019, just a month before that age. And to her very late days, she was very clear, crystal clear, and remembered and told all of these stories and wanted the cousins to connect and made fun of my German accent when I tried to speak German. And you can see here 4 generations, myself, my younger daughter, Miki, this is a few years ago, and Zila's daughter, Roni. And Zila always mentioned a diary that her late husband, Meir Lotal, had written, and told me that when she passes, we should try and read it. And indeed, when she passed away, her children, Giora, Roni, and Yaara, they looked up for the diary and they found it. And I wanted to read it, but even if my German had been perfect, I couldn't, because it is written in Kunstschrift, and the transcriber I worked with told me he couldn't even read it. So I found someone whose expertise with that, and I want to read you something from the diary, a very short excerpt from 10 years since he was a teenager that he had written, that sheds a little light about what people felt at that time in Germany. So this is Meir's diary, and written in December 1933. I'm on the train from Berlin to Munich. I've nothing to read, nothing to think about. Future plans? To make a plan for the next time has very little meaning right now. March 5th, 1933 presented a big blow once again to German Jews, economically and morally. I couldn't believe it right away. So I need to change. I need to make a move. Where to? To Palestine? It is very close to us. We have relatives there. They had not believed it. No one wanted to believe it. to trade a comfortable life in a villa for a tent, a secure future against uncertainty, and what's more, in a village based on community, Gemeinschaft? Such a thing is only for idealists. The current state of the world proves that their community is impractical. And we also have our ideals. We read, we do sports, and we have our wealth. Over there, they live a simple life, work a lot, and enjoy their growth, while here, again, we are hanging in the air. Inspired and supported by my parents, I decided to go to Palestine. I believe that I should stay until they can go as well, but they insist that it would be more helpful to them if I move first. So I will leave the family business and I move over before they do. We have all changed. August is now Aryeh. Meir, myself, Aryeh is a farmer, Otto is a blacksmith, and Erich with Susie are already on the way. And then a few months later, he already writes from his kibbutz in Tel Yosef, and he says, that's it. I'm now in Palestine. I am sitting on my bed in a former chicken coop, which is currently my and my comrades' home. And he says the reunion with the brothers and sisters was wonderful. They've already settled in well, and I think they have found what they are looking for. I work in construction. There is a lot of construction going on here, and there is a lot to do. The work is very hard, 9, 10 hours a day. You are a real worker here. You are expected to perform well, and you have a strong feeling of satisfaction at the end of the day. And then he says, I moved in with Tila. She was in Munich on Hachshara, that's kind of a training before moving to Israel at the time. And as it went, we just liked each other, and we moved in together 2 months ago. The only problem is that we live in a tent. And there he is, Lothar Meir, saying goodbye to his parents and heading out to Israel. And in those years, between 1933 and 1935, all of the 5 siblings of the Adler, or the children of the Adler, have moved to Israel.
So Hagar, all the children were in Israel, but Karl and Amelia remained in Munich, though I understand they actually did go to Palestine. Could you explain that a little bit about their trip, and yet they didn't immigrate?
Yes. In 1935, they headed for a 2-month trip to Israel, leaving by boat. They left this, we found this photo album, Unsere Leben in Eretz Israel, and you can see here the boat and the top dock. And when they, in the album, they actually did a sketch of what the kibbutz looked like from an aerial view. And they wrote this beautiful 16 pages of an account of their visit to Israel. And they say about meeting the children and how the youngest son, when they could hardly recognize him because he was so wide and tanned. And what wonderful it was to see the grandchildren who were born, and they brought them gifts and they brought them chocolate, and the children opened the gift straight away, but the chocolates, they wouldn't. They took the chocolate and the candy to the children's home, and they divided them equally with all the other children. And Karl and Amelia was so impressed by how deeply rooted socialism and communal life has grown on these children. And you can see them here on the mountain. Everyone was dressed nicely in white clothes for the occasion. But you can see straight away, Karl and Amelia, Karl even in his tie, stand out in such a different view to what they were accustomed to in Germany. And yes, they went back to Germany. I mean, the kids told us that they tried to convince them to stay or to go back and join them. But for whatever reason, they decided to go back to Germany and to stay there.
So Actually, Lothar's diary is very, very interesting in terms of, I think, outlining a lot of the ambivalences or the problems that that people foresaw in leaving Germany and going somewhere else. And in the case of Karl and Emilia, they tragically went back to Munich. Can you tell us what happened then? They went back in 1935, correct?
Yes, they did go back in 1935. Obviously, the financial situation deteriorated with the rules against Jews and against regulating how property was held. At some point, they were forced to close the factory, which was Aryanized, to sell the villa, leaving a lot of the treasures in there. They moved to another apartment. And in Pogromnacht, Karl Adler, like many other Jews, was arrested and deported to Dachau. And from what we know, Emilia believed that he would be released because of his high standing, his past as a soldier and high officer. And as is clear from what we're seeing now, that didn't happen. We don't know exactly the circumstances of the death. We were able to obtain this death certificate, which attests to a heart condition. There are a few versions about what actually happened. Some say he died, he had a heart attack during one of the investigations. Another version is that he was actually being released, and on his way out, on the way out to the Dachau gate, he was shot in the back and died. What we do know is that Emilia was shocked. She was very surprised. She did believe he was being released. And instead of receiving him back, she received the coffin. And she was able to get his body back, quite a privilege, and had his body cremated. And that's what happened.
So I think if you show the next slide, Hagar, we can see, and again, the timing here is really very jarring because only a few days after Karl was murdered in Dachau, there were visitors who came to the Adler apartment. And as I understand, Emilia was way too distraught even to see them. Her sister was the person who had to deal with the Gestapo. And what we're seeing here is the protocol from the confiscation of the artworks that belonged to Karl and Emilia Adler. Some of them had already been left behind when they had to move apartments from their bigger villa to this smaller apartment closer to the city center. That you can see what's highlighted here is the date. So you can see it's only a few days after Karl Adler was murdered. And it's a list of the items that the Gestapo looked at in the apartment and that they subsequently confiscated. And the other highlighted line is a name of somebody who was with them, Dr. Ernst Neumann, who was the director of the Maximilianum in Munich. And it's another one of those really sort of unbelievable details about all of these protocols, because in order to make decisions about what to confiscate, they were supposedly taken away, what they call Sicherstellung, for safekeeping. It was basically robbing these collections, and they engaged experts to come and help them. And these were people who had worked in museums, who did work in museums, and who often had been known or were known to the collectors, because in the days before 1933, so many of the Jewish collectors were patrons of museums, were actively involved in collectors' circles. It wasn't just a question of buying art and having it in your home. It was really an active community of engagement and sharing ideas and sharing this cultural patrimony. And then you see how these very same people then come and aid the Gestapo. And also, if you show the next slide, Hagar, you can see that everything that was confiscated was then brought to the Bavarian National Museum. So the museums literally profited from this theft. Some of it was later another way for the Third Reich to generate funds because they were sold to the museums, actually bought the confiscated art, the art that had been confiscated from Jewish families. And in Munich, we have these protocols. And we know that there were close to 70 of these Jewish collections that in the days after the November 1938 pogrom were visited. You see the next slide? So in March 1939, Emilia was able to leave Germany and emigrate to Palestine. We talked about the confiscation. The only work of art that she was allowed to take with her is this portrait of Karl by the Munich artist Josef Scharl. So I wanted to ask you, what was it that attracted Karl to modern artists, really actually his contemporaries, to contemporary artists? And this portrait seems to be emblematic actually also of his relationship with those artists. You could tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I was really interested in. The story in the article that I showed before is about how in 2007, the confiscation files were found in the cellar, basically, of the archives. And with the case of Karl, on top of the, like I said, the classic artist, he had a passion for modern art. And he was good friends with many of the artists. He supported some of them. We found in the family album photos of Alfred Kubin, maybe taken by my grandfather, I don't know, in his home in Zwickel. We know he was good friends with Josef Scharl, who drew that portrait, and his wife, Leni. He was good friends with the sculptor, Josef Erbel, and many others. Actually, Erich Glass, my grandfather, his beloved son-in-law, must have influenced this passion for modern art, being such himself. And he described later on that a lot of the collection was based on personal relationship. And like you said, the portrait that Emilia was allowed to take is an example of that. And then we decided we wanted to.
Oops,
Sorry?
I was going to say, okay, that brings us to the work you're doing now, actually. And you're involved in a really intriguing process, and you're collaborating with an expert on provenance research. And it would be interesting to know something about the process that you're engaged in and how you and your colleague are going about that work.
Yes. So it's true. At some point, I mean, I was calling the museums and writing and the city archives of Munich, and I realized I didn't have enough knowledge to do this. And then I was referred to Dr. Voigt, Vanessa Voigt, whom you see here, and I looked at her website and realized that it was very relevant. I mean, she is not only one of the first provenance researchers in Germany from the year 2001, she was actually together with Dr. Horst, I forget his last name, sorry, one of the two researchers who were commissioned by the city of Munich after the confiscation files were found to research the art and the stories behind it. So we met over the phone with Ido, my cousin. We started talking and we engaged in a small research, and later on submitted an application to the DCK, and we're able to start a real research program, which we're doing now. So we looked at pictures and at the protocols, and we could have the cousins also find some albums, and then Vanessa could look at the pictures on the walls and try to recognize them. In this case, it's a pretty known portrait by Stelbauer, correct? Maybe. And then retrieve, like Dr. Hartmann said in the beginning, a list, you can't really read it here, but like a spreadsheet of about 133 lines of works of art that were taken. Some of it was documented in a lot of detail and sent directly to museums. The modern art was not so respected, and some of it was just floated in the free market. And we can see here an example of the kind of detail that Vanessa can find, you know, the kind of work and the size, the technique that was used, where it was taken for, stolen from, and where it ended up in the first stage. And then looking at documents of purchase and moving of goods and archive, many documents in archives, it is possible to slowly try and reconstruct the stories of these works of art and try to see where they had gone after this.
So I just wanted to add, because I read through some of the reports about the restitution process, and it was really quite chilling to read it. First of all, it took a very, very unusually long time, from 1958 to 65. And part of the problem was that many of the works that had been stolen, actually, we showed that protocol, but many of them had not been in the protocol. Maybe many of them had not been documented. And the courts were very insistent on proof, and it was very, very difficult for Amelia to bring that proof. And one of the things that's interesting then is to see all the witnesses who came. And you saw, I think, through that, the people who've been involved with their life. And they had to come and basically offer their recollections of the Adler home and what they remembered in terms of artworks and furniture and carpets and everything else. And that ranged from artist friends, the widow of Joseph Scharl, and former domestic employees, former neighbors. And I think one could say quite, it's accurate to say that Amelia Adler was really not well treated by the court, and she seemed to have been altogether quite devastated by her experiences.
That's true.
That's your impression as well.
She was ruined, and she couldn't really testify. I mean, with the help of a dear friend here in Leipzig, Tom, I also read the restitution proceedings, and like you said, friends testified, her sisters testified. My grandfather was very active, and in a way, the restitution was her second prosecution. And it was not an easy time at all, and it dragged on about 10 years, you know, to get it sorted, so to speak.
So, Hagar, in preparation for this evening, we had a lot of conversations, and one of the incredible stories that you told me concerns one of the few items that Amelia, in addition to the Scharl portrait, did bring with her from Munich to Palestine.
Yeah, so she brought a few items, very few. Like we said, one of them was the portrait by Joseph Scharl that we saw before. And another was the tin can with Karl's ashes. And so my grandfather, Elif, met his beloved and admired father-in-law again in this setting, where the ashes were laid for eternal peace on a small slanted piece of land at the footsteps of Mount Carmel, the cemetery of Butzegur. And being an artist, he also was the one to sort of carve the tombstone and lay the ashes to peace. And then about 7 years later, in the 29th of June, 1946, was what was known to call Shabbat Shchora, the Black Sabbath. It was the time of the British Mandate in Israel, and weapons were not allowed to be kept. Of course, they had been kept, but hidden. In kibbutzim, they were hidden in what was called slicks, so caches of weapons hid underneath floor, in double walls, in children's houses, on the top, above the ceiling, under the ground, in many different creative types of what was known as slicks. And in this day of June 29th, there was a big raid on all of the kibbutzim, or on many of the kibbutzim. Yagur, the kibbutz that I grew up in, is a very, very big kibbutz and was actually the biggest constellation of these slicks. And tanks actually drove through the kibbutz at dawn, and British officers came in and basically combed the kibbutz, leaving havoc. The men were sent to a detention camp in Rafiach, and they used equipment, they used metal detectors to try and find the weapons. They poured water into pipes to see if there were actually airways leading to some underground. And one of these metal detectors had beeped over a small slanted piece of land at the footsteps of Mount Carmel. Yes, it detected metal, and the tombstone was smashed, only to find underneath no weapons, but the tin can Karl Adler.
That's an amazing story. So I think I want to ask you one final question, if I may, before we open it up to questions. And that is, you're engaged in you've embarked on an amazing journey. And I wanted to know, what kind of impact has that had on you and on your extended family thus far? And also, finally, what do you hope to learn from this whole process, and what do you plan to do with that knowledge?
Yeah, maybe this is a good place to go from a symbol of death back to life. And really, I mean, it's a heart-wrenching story, and there's a lot of sadness in it, but there's also a lot of courage and a lot of happiness and a lot of life. And here's Shoshana with 3 of her children and a cousin who made it to Israel, and many, many more children were born. And the 5 children of Karl and Emilia raised big, beautiful, artistic, creative, kind-hearted families in Israel, in different kibbutzim. And I, at first, just thought that I would learn more about Eri, about my grandfather, and maybe write a book. But then through this process of researching the wider family, I connected with cousins and uncles and aunts in many places, including family that made it to South Africa in 1934, and family that tried to make it to South Africa 2 years later and was stopped because no more refugees would be received, and made a U-turn to Mozambique and ended up after the revolution in Portugal, and family from the States, and of course, a lot of family in Israel. And you can see here one of the reunions. This is just one branch, our small branch. We're a big family, and in a way, this story is something that connects us. We're in good contact, but it's such a big family that I've always been in touch with the immediate, or maybe the second, in some cases, third circle, but not so many of them. And being able to, in the height of the pandemic, get on a Zoom call with about 30 cousins, a few of which I've never met before, was something that I will take with me for life. And I think, in my family, there's been a lot of tragedy, and some people died, prematurely. And when you meet new people and you share your life experience, sometimes people are delicate and they say, can I ask about this, or what happened there? I hope it's okay. I hope it's not too painful. And I always tell them, no, it's not. Please ask, because I think the hardest thing is to be forgotten. And you said it before about Karl and Emilia, about the collection, about the people, about what happened to them. And when you remember, when you tell the stories, when you find out more information, then they're always here, right? They're among us. And this is how I've always felt about my parents. And now I feel it about other family members farther away in relation to me. And here are 2 of them, Karl and Emilia.
I think now would be a great time to open up the conversation. Thank you, Hagar, for sharing so much very personal information and experiences with all of us. There are a lot of participants with us this evening. You please feel free to ask questions. You can put the question directly into the chat, or you can just indicate in the chat that you have a question you'd like to ask. Also, please feel free to ask in German if that's more comfortable than English. We'd love to hear from you. Hagar and I understand German, and we may answer in English. She may answer in English, but please feel free.
Thank you very much, Hagar and Emily. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Und ich darf auch noch einmal die Bitte oder auch die Aufforderung an alle richten. Jetzt wäre die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen. Aber vielleicht geht es vielen Ihnen so wie mir, da ich schon einiges davon wusste, habe ich aber doch heute auch noch wieder vieles Neues erfahren. Und das muss man auch erstmal wieder ein bisschen verarbeiten. Da waren auf jeden Fall sehr viel eindrucksvolle Bilder, sehr viel eindrucksvolle Fotografien heute, die ich das erste Mal gesehen habe.
Thank you.
So, maybe while people are gathering their thoughts. Oh, here we go. Here's a question from Deidre Berger. Hi, how are you? And she says, thank you, Hagar, for sharing your fascinating family history. How much of the art could be restituted?
Okay, well, we've just started in July to work with Vanessa. So I don't know. I mean, and it's not our ultimate goal. I mean, it would be nice to find something, but it's about the story and the connection. So we don't know. I mean, right now we have found the Karl Adler portrait, which is with the family. It came to Israel with Emilia. And when we started speaking, one of my parents' cousins was able to find it in a carton after remembering that it had been hanging on the wall. So, but the rest is yet to come, and I'm looking forward to it.
Of course, a short time after the beginning of the project, I think Vanessa and you have some traces, and of course we will see at the end of the project how successful the work was. Mm-hmm.
I should also just add, because I don't know if the question is sort of looking forward or also looking back, but in terms of the restitution after the war, it's quite complicated. Looking, having read through some of the files, and I haven't read all of them. There are many hundreds of pages, but it seems like also because so much of the collection were graphic works, and they were much easier to disappear, and also to specifically identify. And Emilia was presenting evidence, including some of the testimony, where people would come and say, there were these many portfolios, and this portfolio had 10 works by Klinger, and this had 15 works by another artist. And she, in the end, got some monetary compensation, again, much less than really should have been coming to her because of the difficulty of presenting proof that the court would accept. But it raises a whole other question about the difficulty sometimes of identifying multiples. Works of graphics. There do not seem to be any other questions. So I think,
there is a question.
Here's a question. From Paulina Hansen, thank you for your presentation. Could you speak a little about the reception of what you have found out in Munich, and if there are any plans by the city to commemorate your family?
We haven't made anything public yet. Like we said, it's very early days of the research, and part of my commitment to this project is to make things public, and that's why I'm so thankful for the Zentrum für Kulturverluste for organizing such events that raise awareness to the whole issue and to specific stories. when we're done, we'll see. You know, when it comes to my grandfather, we've done a lot of work with exhibitions and creating a mural with a local artist in Leipzig, Lou Carter, and things like that. When it comes to Karl and Emilia, depending on what we find, I would very much like to make it public, to have the art appreciated if we find it by other people, and to tell the story in a way that more people can share it and learn from it. I've not spoken to the city of Munich yet. Too soon. Okay. So I think we're at the top of the hour, and from my side, I would like to just thank everyone who came here. I see a lot of people from my circles, from different places in the world who joined, and that really moves me. And I'd like to thank the center for organizing it, like I said, and Vanessa for being a partner in our research, and my cousins and aunts and uncles who are my companions in this journey, and you, Emily, for the preparation, for the input, and for your insights, and for helping me share this with a wider audience.
So I just want to add my thanks to everyone. I see so many colleagues also of mine on this call, which is really wonderful to see. And I want to thank you, Hagar, because I think your story makes it so clear that these collections are not about, or not only about the objects, the art, the value, but they're about whole lives and a whole network of relationships. And the objects reveal that. They reveal a whole way of life. And that's one of the reasons this research and your journey is really so important. So
can I add just one word?
Sure.
Shalom, Hagar.
Hi, Gadi.
My name is Gadi. Hagar is a first cousin, and I'm speaking from the kibbutz. And I'm very proud with my little cousin. It's a pretty amazing evening. You know, we're 2 days before Yom Kippur, which is like a very spiritual day for us. And a few years ago, when Hagar took her family and left for Germany, of all places, it really brought up thoughts and feelings. And now when I realize the journey that she's done, and how she went so far and looking for her roots and her personal story, I couldn't be more proud. And it's such an amazing and inspiring journey, Hagar, that you've made, and I'm looking forward to hear and learn so much more about what you do and what you discover. Kol hakavod.
Thank you. It's very kind. It's of course not just me. Like I said, it's a team effort of many cousins and my siblings. And yeah, thank you for that. Very nice words.
Ja, ich kann mich vielleicht jetzt erstmal wieder auf Deutsch dem Dank nur anschließen. Vor allen Dingen auch noch einmal meine Bewunderung, dass Hagar Lev so viel Arbeit auch investiert hat und uns so viel an historischen Fotos oder so viele historische Fotos gezeigt hat. Ich würde jetzt noch, wenn keine weiteren Fragen sind, nach der Danksagung noch einmal an meine Kollegin Lena Grundhuber übergeben, die die nächste Veranstaltung doch schon einmal anmoderieren möchte oder zumindest auch dringend empfehlen möchte. Ich bedanke mich bei allen für das Interesse und für alle, die in den nächsten Tagen Feiertage verleben werden. Da wünsche ich natürlich friedliche Feiertage, ob in Israel oder anderenorts auf der Welt. Vielen Dank.
Yeah, thanks again for sharing the story and for this very interesting evening, Hagar and Emily. It was a pleasure working with you for us, and I hope to meet you someday when Corona's over. And yeah, we hope to meet all of you in 2 weeks when Dodi Reifenberg will be talking about his family the Ginsbergs from Berlin. Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good evening. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.